Welcome everybody. My name is Joe with Others Electric, and this is another episode of Others Ed, where we talk and discuss and go over electrical code and electrical install for the professional and the DIYer. Again, like I said, my name is Joe. I'm the qualifier at Others Electric, business owner. I have my Florida State Fire Inspector's license and Fire Plans Examiner license. I hold a license in the state of Florida for a residential building inspector, commercial and residential electrical inspector, and electrical plans examiner. So in this episode, we are going to be talking about the 2023 Florida Building Code Residential, and we're going to be talking about GFCIs, Chapter 210.8 of the NEC. More specifically, it's 210.8F. I got a call from a friend of mine, the branch manager at City Electric in Boca, George, and he asked me about the code updates for the GFI requirements in residential for 240 volt circuits. So we talked about it, and he asked me a question that he heard something of the fact that all 2-pole breakers inside of a residence on a residential project need to be GFI protected. So I got reading into the code, and while that is not true that all 2-pole breakers or 240 volt circuits inside of a residence need to be GFI protected, there are significant changes that we do need to go over. Now, this code in Florida took effect on January 1st, 2024. So this year, the 8th edition of the Florida Building Code came into effect, which brought into effect in Florida the 2020 National Electrical Code. So let's get right into it. So the first thing I want to do is we're going to look at, let's look at the code. So here's what the code says in the 2020 NEC. So let's take a look here. So if we go to 210.8A, dwelling units, and 210.8A specifically discusses 210.8A specifically discusses GFCI requirements for electrical installations, and 210.8.A is for dwelling units. In this video, we're not going to talk specifically about, we're not going to specifically talk about the changes to the code, the whole section, A through, or 1 through 8. I just want to go over H, specifically H. So let's go, because that was what was brought to me in a question. So let's go down to H. Okay. So, F, I'm sorry. 210.8F of the 2020 NEC, National Electrical Code. It says here that all outdoor outlets for dwelling units other than those covered in 210.8A3, exception to 3, that are supplied by single-phase branch circuits rated 150 volts to ground or less, 50 amps or less, shall have ground fault circuit interruption protection for personnel. So let's break that down. So first thing they're talking about, so they're going all outdoor outlets for dwellings. So dwellings is your 1 and 2 family, right? Your single family home, or your two family home, your duplexes and things like that. Okay? And what it's saying here is that are supplied by single phase branch circuits. So that's either a single pole breaker or a 2-pole breaker. Don't get confused by the single phase. Single phase also includes your 2-pole breakers. Single phase branch circuits rated 150 volts to ground or less. So that's everything in a house. Everything in a house is going to be 150 volts to ground or less, all of it, okay? So, and then it says 50 amps or less. So if it's a 50 amp, 30 amp, 20 amp, 15 amp, it's included in here. Shall have ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel. So my initial thought when I read that, I'm thinking, whoa, what about HVAC equipment? Because that's going to be very difficult to put on a GFI, because if it's an older unit, you know, it might not work very well, because the HVAC units, condensing units, they're not built to that highest standard. So I did some research, and yes, come to find out that the last UL standard for HVAC equipment was like 1996, and they had like very little provisions for chassis leakage, minimum chassis leakages. So recently, the last UL, I think they did it in 2022 or 2021, they upgraded so now if you wanted to get a piece of HVAC equipment listed under UL, the maximum amount of chassis leakage was 10 milliamps. Well, that won't work. You can't put a 10 milliamp listed, you know, equipment that can have up to 10 milliamps of chassis leakage on a GFCI breaker, because they're made to trip at 5 milliamps and above. So that won't work. So there's been some hubbub back and forth, and they did some, you know, some updates to the code, and they've been going back and forth, and they are going to change the UL requirements for HVAC equipment, but it's not going to be done until the future. And they're going to mandate it that the chassis leakage for HVAC equipment be less than 5 milliamps in the future, but that's not going to happen. So how do we meet that code if that code, the new code, is telling us, in Florida now, is telling us that all outdoor outlets need to be GFCI protected if they're 50 amps or less. Most condensing units are 50 amps or less. The majority of them, I would say, are probably 30 amps. Very rarely do they go above 40 or 45 or 50. So most every condensing unit is going to be included in that code. So let's take a look. Now, we're going to have to go to the Florida, the 2023 or the 8th edition of the Florida Building Code to look at how Florida is handling this code. Because if you know, if you've been in the codes for a couple years now, more than a couple years, you'll know that in 2020, when we last updated the code, the Florida Building Code Residential, or the Residential Building Code in Florida, stopped using its own electrical code. If you go into the 2017 or the 5th edition or the 6th edition of the Residential Building Code in Florida, it had its own electrical requirements. So in 2020, they did away with that, and it said, for the electrical requirements of this code, please see the 2017 National Electrical Code. That was how they changed it in 2020. Well, and we stopped going to the Residential Building Code for all of our electrical requirements. We went straight to the NEC. Well, I found out today that there are amendments to the Florida Building Code Residential to the electrical code, and it is exactly this. So let's look. If you go to the Florida Building Code, chapter E3408, there is an amendment, and it reads this. So let's look. So let's look at this right here. We are now in the Florida Residential Building Code 2023, the 8th edition. It reads right here. Section E3408, GFCI protection. The NFPA 70-20 National Electrical Code, Article 210, branch circuits, Section 210.8, ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel is amended to read as follows. Ready? Let's read it together. 210.8, ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel. Ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel shall be provided as required in 210.8A through F. The ground fault circuit interrupter shall be installed in a readily accessible location. Okay, that didn't change. Items A through E are unchanged. Okay, but let's go to F. F, outdoor outlets. All outdoor outlets for dwellings other than those covered in 210.8A3, exception to 3, that are supplied by a single-phase branch circuit rated 150 volts to ground or less, 50 amperes or less, shall have ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel. That's changed. There's an exception. Number 1, ground fault circuit interrupter protection shall not be required on lighting outlets other than those covered in 210C. That's unchanged. But looky here, exception number 2. They added the residential building code in Florida, 8th edition, added this amendment. GFCI protection shall not be required for listed and labeled HVAC equipment. So, guys, there you have it. Yes, all outdoor outlets have to be GFCI protected if they're 50 amps or less inside a residence, except for HVAC equipment. That will change because they are changing the UL listing for requirements for HVAC equipment, but I think it's going to change in January 1st, 2026 or something like that. So until further notice, you do not have to put HVAC equipment, outdoor HVAC equipment on a GFI breaker. But if you have a 40 or 50 amp pool heater, it's got to be GFCI protected. If you've got an outdoor receptacle for a car, it's going to have to be GFCI protected. Feel free to give me an email or give me a call at the number listed below or from our website. And if you have any questions or anything that you'd specifically like me to go over, hit me up. I'd appreciate it. And thank you and have a wonderful day.